Leyla, I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast. You've written a beautiful book about your journey. And one of the things that stood out to me in the beginning was just your love of anthropology. And obviously, you're now an anthropologist, you're also a religion scholar. And I'm wondering if you share a little bit about where that passion came from and how those two passions have shaped you.
Oh, that's really a good question. I think, well, first of all, I have a lot of love for anthropology, but I'm also struggling with anthropology because it's also a problematic discipline. It has a colonial, imperial history and all of that. And also as a queer person and a queer Muslim person, it's sometimes not so easy to be in that field that is by definition still designed to have a very, very, always having a gaze on the other, basically, on the subaltern, which is pretty much still the standard. But still, yes, I do love anthropology very much. And that started in my childhood already because I was always very curious about the differences in human cultures, in particular when it comes to the constructions of sexuality and gender. And of course, that because from my earliest age on, I felt there was an issue with that. I had this experience that society had a certain idea of sexuality and gender, and I didn't agree with that. Society also had all kinds of very specific ideas about identities, and I think, I grew up in Germany, and I still live in Germany, and I think German society in particular has very strict ideas regarding identity. And yeah, that bothered me from childhood on. And so I always ask that question, this just a matter of this place, this culture that I'm living in, or is it universal? What do other cultures say about this? What do other communities say about this? And this is something that fascinates me up to this day. And I think anthropology is a very important corrective to any kinds of
Mm.
essentializations, fundamentalisms, any kind of ideology that tells you that you can only think about human culture or identity in only one certain way.
I think that's like amazing, like how curious and like such intelligent thinking so early in your childhood. Because I'm thinking about when I was a kid, I didn't really question like what culture told me, what my parents told me about things, but you were already very early on questioning how culture was telling you how gender and sexuality should be perceived. Have you always been like just hyper curious?
I guess so, yeah. Hyper curious and also hyper skeptic, just not
Yeah.
accepting what people tell me because it was so clear to me that what they are telling me cannot be the only right way.
As you started to explore how different cultures wrote and thought about different genders and sexuality, were there any cultures that fascinated you or were helpful to you during that time?
Well, obviously, because from a very early age on already I started to identify with Islam and, both as a culture and a faith. I was in particular interested um, in that, what was going on there in the Islamic world, in Muslim context, and also in South Asia, because due to, well, several reasons that I describe a little bit more in detail in my book, South Asia became particularly interesting to me. And yeah, but still, I mean, even up to this day, I think I, even as a Muslim, for example, I am very interested also in what, for example, Siberian shamanist cultures say about
Mm.
gender or sexuality, or what traditional African religions say about this. Because I think in the end, if we are honest enough and accept that there are different ways of looking at this, then there can be no, we have to be curious about all possibilities in that field.
What drew you to Islam? What was the draw there? Because there is a sort of that narrative that's out there that certain religious groups, and I think of Islam or Christianity or Judaism, sometimes can harm transgender people specifically. And so I see a lot of reason for people who are transgender or have any sort of identity that's not accepted by their religion to just leave that religion. And so I'm kind of curious about what do you think drew you to Islam?
I think the most important thing is that my first encounters with Islam were through people. There has always been, even though my family is not Muslim, my parents are not Muslim, but there have been a lot of connections in my family history also with the Muslim world. I grew up with relatives who had connections to the Muslim world, and when I was a kid, my parents, they loved traveling, and we traveled to several Muslim countries already. So that was my first encounter with Islam. It was not just a theoretical encounter, and I could see very early in my life that this predominant media image of Islam that we also have in Europe very much is not the only side of Muslim societies and Muslim cultures and Islam as a faith. I knew that very early in my life. And then what always impressed me about Islam was precisely this thing that on the one hand, it is a very dogmatic religion and it's very uniformist. So there are things that most Muslims all over the world agree on. You know, almost all Muslims pray in Arabic, for example, even though Arabic may not be their mother tongue. But there's also an incredible diversity in the Muslim world, and there are so many different cultural expressions, and that manifests in the theological concept as well. So there is this idea of this overwhelming unity of God. I mean, monotheism is very the most important principle in Islam, and at the same time, in particular in Muslim mysticism, there is this idea that the plurality of our world, you know, all that beauty that manifests in that this whole diversity is a manifestation of that one unity, you know, like one light that just becomes this kaleidoscopic rainbow, um, basically. And this is an idea that I find until this day I find it very appealing, and I found it very appealing as a child already. This idea that okay, there is this diversity, and this diversity is beautiful, and it is
Mm,
actually it is a manifestation of the divine unity in the end.
yeah, I love the way you just said that. So there are a couple moments in your book that just like stopped me. I just had to sit with what you wrote, and one of those passages um, was in one of your early chapters. And I want to read this and kind of just get your thoughts on it. This is the point where you talk about where you are realizing who you are, and you say, "For some time, I saw myself as gay, and I wondered if I could find love, fulfillment in the gay community. But after a while, it became clear to me that that was not what I wanted. I never wanted to be attractive to a man as a man. I experienced myself as a young woman, albeit with a body that felt increasingly at odds with my inner feelings and self perception. I felt as if I was in a prison whose walls were getting narrower and narrower each day, threatening to crush me, period." And I stopped there. It gave me chills reading that uh, because you describe like what it feels like to be like in this prison, feeling trapped. And I wonder if you can kind of talk about that, being Muslim, realizing you're a woman, and kind of sitting with that.
Yeah, I mean, puberty was the hardest time in my life. Being a teenager was the hardest time in my life. It was horrible, going through all these internal changes and then also physical changes and not knowing what to do with it. And I have to say this because people ask me this, you know, people ask all the time, oh, is this not particularly difficult when you are a Muslim? Well, it was not easy in the mosque. You know, I started going to the mosque as a teenager regularly, and yeah, there were issues there. I was presented with a very gender segregated space there. Most mosques still work that way today as well. And of course, in the khutbahs, which is the, you know, the Friday sermons, you always, you hear these kind of messages that do not, I never made this experience that I was directly attacked, but you just get this message that you should not, you know, you should conform to the gender that was assigned to you at your birth, and that comes with a specific sexuality and so on and so on. So you just know that, and that was not easy. I have to say, though, that the German mainstream society around me, I grew up in a very small rural town, that did not make it easier either. You know, it's the same thing basically. And in the 80s and 90s, when I grew up, there was no knowledge whatsoever on trans issues in society. I mean, all you could see was maybe, you know, we also had these Jerry Springer like
Mm,
afternoon talk shows in Germany, and there you had trans people basically as freaks,
mm,
but that was it. Um, and even talk about homosexuality was still very much taboo. I mean, there was partly homosexuality homosexuality was still criminalized
mm,
in Germany until the 1990s, and there were things that you were just forbidden to do as a gay teenager that straight teenagers would be allowed to do, you know. And so this whole atmosphere created a lot of pressure for me, not just being a Muslim and what the mosque offered me, but also what mainstream society offered me. And I tried many, many times to change myself, to become somebody else, to suppress my sexuality. It always just led to a terrible backlash because, as we all know, when you suppress something, then it just comes back with a vengeance. And that is exactly what happened to me. It led to very difficult, um, yeah, traumatic experiences, and it has affected my mental health. And it does affect my mental health until today. I mean, I'm much, much better today, many decades on, but there are still issues that I'm struggling with that go back to that time. And I was very suicidal.
mm.
I cried a lot, and I just there was a long, long time, many, many years where I was incredibly happy and didn't know what to do with my life until in the end I knew, okay, I have to make some kind of decision about this.
You display so much resilience and so much power in your story. For those listening in who maybe are feeling like you did then, maybe it's because of religion, maybe because of culture. What would you say to them right now? Maybe they're feeling the way you described as being trapped and feeling crushed.
It's a bit of a cliche sentence, but it does get better. It really does if you're willing to confront it. I do not think I you know, I wouldn't say that there is a path that really works for all. I mean, for a lot of people, finally, you know, becoming who you are in your everyday life and coming out is the right path. But I also understand that there are just people who live in situations where that just is not possible. But even if that is not possible, your own your own psychology will work around that to some extent. You do grow older, and you develop some kind of maturity.
Mm.
But the important thing is that you do not evade who you are and what you feel internally, whether you can show that to the outside world or not. But you have to keep thinking about it. You have to keep processing it, and then it will get better.
You mentioned some of the gender segregation that happens within the mosque, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that because I know when I think about here in the U.S., one of the issues is like the bathroom debate and the struggles that trans people have to like not to use their own bathroom, and and then there's like, well, you can use the all gender bathroom, is that that's the solution, and it's like that's not empowering at all, that's not affirming at all. And so how did you can you talk a little bit about the gender maybe the gender differences that are happening within the mosque?
Well, let's put it this way. The average, first of all, there has been for a long time an issue with a lot of mosques when it comes to access for women. I mean, you still have a lot of mosques where it's even not expected that women will even enter the mosque. So you still have that in some mosques in Europe, in some mosques in North America. You have that in some regions of the Muslim world. It's very, speaking about the diversity of the Muslim societies, that's very, you have Muslim countries where that is no issue at all,
Mm.
but you have Muslim countries where that is an issue, and that reflects on the different diaspora communities here in the West as well. Um, so is so there is that, and then usually in most mosques all over the world, female and male spaces are segregated. Similar to what you would see in a lot of Orthodox Jewish spaces, for example, where you have that as well. Um, and then you sometimes see how male privilege kicks in, because there may be a female space in a mosque, but it's definitely the smaller space and is not as nice as
Mm.
the male space, so you have that a lot as well. That's the traditional setup that developed historically. It's not sure that there has been a lot of feminist Muslim feminist work on this that says that it was not like that in the Prophet's time. It's also interesting that, for example, in Mecca, the most holy place of Islam, the pilgrimage place, it's just logistically not possible to completely segregate female and male spaces. So in the most holy
Mm.
space of Islam, it's not that much of an issue actually.
Mm.
Um, and there have been a lot of inclusive, progressive, or also LGBTQI inclusive Muslim initiatives in recent years and decades that also have mosque spaces now, where this segregation does not exist anymore, where you also have female imams, for example. The most famous one is Amina Wadud, a feminist Muslim scholar, originally from the US. So you have that now, but it's still very much in the minority, and that didn't exist at all when I grew up in the 90s. It was
Mm.
not existent at all.
As you were beginning to think about your gender and where you belonged within the mosque, can you talk about maybe the experience of first having access to the women's area?
Well, my first access to the women's area was in India, then when, that part of my life that I write a lot about in my book. And it wasn't even so much in mosque spaces, but the interesting
Mm.
thing was that I noticed that very average and actually quite traditional Muslims in India and South Asia had no issue with introducing me, for example, to the women of their own households, which lived very much in segregation. You still have that in some very, traditional areas of South Asia, where the women basically, they only leave the house with very rarely and heavily veiled, and usually men do not have access to those private quarters. And it was so amazing for me, not not the thing that I was allowed to enter a female space, but more the recognition that came from the society that this was okay, for a trans woman, that it was, or rather, a third gender hijra, as they would identify and interpret me, um, to be there present in those female spaces. That was very interesting for me. Um, Nowadays with mosques, I mean, I'm involved with a couple of the, inclusive, progressive spaces that I've mentioned. I'm here in Germany. I'm active in an organization that calls itself Liberal Muslim. I've worked a couple of times in the UK with the Inclusive Mosque. Um, and there it's so wonderful for me that segregation is just not an issue that I need to think about. Because even today, when here in the Western diaspora, I want to go to a mosque, I'm always, when it's a traditional mosque, I'm always a bit anxious because I don't know what will happen to me when I go into the female space. Will people read me? as a trans woman? Will they see that I'm a trans woman and then maybe throw me out because they are not comfortable with that?
Mm.
Because this is something that could happen, and it's even today it's still an issue for me. Similar to the what you know what you mentioned, the bathroom issue as well. I mean, I'm actually, I'm now 41, and at this age, you're just becoming much more relaxed about a lot of things. But I do remember that when I was 30, at that time still, when I was going out anywhere, I was really trying to avoid having to go to a public bathroom. And I know a lot of trans people who feel exactly the same because of all these social and political debates, and we're just afraid, we're just afraid of offending people by going to a bathroom. Basically, it's all these discussions affect us.
You mentioned something that I'd love for you to expand on. You talk about the third gender communities when you were in India, and I loved how you talk about that because so many, I think about just here in the US, we have this binary thinking about gender. And you talk about going to India and joining, I hope I pronounce it right, the hijras. Can you talk about joining the hijras and what that meant for you?
Hmm. So when I was, as I mentioned, I was a struggling teenager. I didn't know what to do with all of the feelings that I had, and in particular, I also didn't know what to do with it with regards to my Muslim faith. So I and as I mentioned, I was a little anthropologist. I was interested in what other cultures would say. So I did a lot of research on that, and I discovered this identity, this South Asian identity of people who are, well, there's a debate on whether we can say they are exactly the same as transgender people in the West or not. There's something to be discussed about how universal these categories are. And I do talk a bit about that in my book as well. But I realize it's something very similar, at least. It's mostly people who are assigned male at birth, but who identify more in a feminine way, and they are categorized as a third gender traditionally in South Asia. Um, and it was actually thanks to a US American trans activist, Annie Ogborn, that I had my first encounters with that community in India, and then later I came back alone several times on my own, and eventually also built up many connections in Pakistan, which is India's sister country. And I'm actually right now much more connected to the Pakistani community, which is also much more heavily Muslim and also exists within a Muslim mainstream society than the Indian community, which also is Muslim but exists in a mostly non-Muslim mainstream society. And when I went there, and for the first time, and that was around the time that I had decided to transition, and I made the decision to live as a woman. And I was still struggling a lot with that in my German context. And I came there, and I do not want to say that everything there in South Asia is happy and fine. There are a lot of issues. There is a lot of marginalization of trans people there. But what I noticed was that there was a certain kind of very traditional visibility, and there was a traditional space in society for these people that did not exist in any Western society. So, um, as I just mentioned, I was so surprised that very traditional conservative Muslims would just invite me to their homes and would see no issue with that, with me meeting the women of their household, for example. And this was a general message that I was given a lot in South Asia, both by Hindus and by Muslims, that okay, this is just a part of nature. It's part of, as Muslims would say, it's part of God's creation, and we need to respect that creation. And then you also have in South Asia traditionally a very strong belief that trans people, or rather third gender people, have a special connection with God because we are different, because we suffer so much in life, because we cannot take part in the normal, happy family life of other people. God grants us certain powers to bless others, or to curse others, which is admittedly, it's not. I mean, when I went to India for the first time, that was 20 years ago, and a lot has changed both in India and Pakistan within these 2 decades. And less people nowadays still believe in these kind of powers. But when I went there, this belief was still very strong, and that impressed me. And I remember that I came back to Germany, and I had a little bit of a a little bit of a hubris, you know. I was thinking, oh, I'm almost like a divine being. I can curse and bless people, and it's only later that I also saw a lot of the problems and the marginalization that the trans community goes through in South Asia. But at that point in my life, as a very, very young trans person, this gave me a lot of strength, and it inspired me.
Like hearing that and also reading your story, like it had to be so empowering to be in a place where you felt unaccepted, to all of a sudden move to an environment not only where you're accepted in society and by the religion, um, but also like being granted, like you are also a blessed person, like you can provide special blessings because of your identity.
Yes, yes, precisely. I mean, it's a mixed bag. I recently talked about that to a German journalist who was also saying, yeah, but this is not, LGBTQI freedom as we envision it nowadays. I said, no, it's not. I mean, it's a bit, um, people respect you, but they're also a bit afraid of you. That is the traditional setup
Hmm.
that I encountered there. And of course, it still marks you as something other. So it's not unproblematic. But still, again, as I said, I mean, I experienced no visibility of trans people in the society that I grew up in at that time. And then going there and seeing that, oh wow, the trans people also can have a meaning, a spiritual meaning, a cultural meaning, that that was just very, very impressive for me.
What was it like initially moving there and having to adapt? Because now you have a new schedule. Your life is changed dramatically. So can you talk a little bit about like what life was like being a Hijra?
Oh yeah, it's a very hierarchical life there. It's a community that lives as I always say, a surrogate family.
Mm.
You could compare it a little bit to the what are they called, the ballroom houses that people would maybe know from the Netflix series
Mm.
Pose, or maybe from Paris is Burning. So you have houses, communities of people who live together, and there's somebody who's the mother. Um, and in India and Pakistan, you would often call the person on top, you would call them the guru, which is, I guess, a word that a lot of people will be familiar with. Guru means actually teacher, but it also has a much more, it says something about your rank in the hierarchy. And the others have to obey the guru. I mean, it's a very, um, it works similar to a traditional patriarchal family, only that all the people in that family happen to be trans people or third gender people. But other than that, the system is very similar. And there are traditional occupations that the third gender community usually has, and they are connected to this idea that we can bless or curse people. So usually hijras would go out and would visit houses where little children were born or where a wedding takes place, and then they would sing and dance there, and then offer blessings. But if they are not paid well for that, they may also say that we can curse you for that, and then usually they are paid. That is usually the main traditional occupation in areas where these traditions still work very well. And as I said, that's changing a lot nowadays. Traditionally, a lot of hijras have also always been involved with sex work. Um, that was very much frowned upon in the Hijra house that I lived in my first years in Delhi. But for example, later in my time in Pakistan, I've spent a lot of time with sex workers there as well, trans sex workers, and sex work in that context not only covers actual sex work, but it's also entertainment work. So it may also just be that they perform for what we would maybe call a bachelor party or something like that. So that is part of it as well. Um, yeah, but all of it is very much regulated by this hierarchical family system, which as all over the world and in all contexts, it can work well and it can be abusive as well. There are good families and there are bad families. There are loving families and there are abusive families, and you will find the exact same in the third gender communities in South Asia. There are houses that are very loving, very caring, and there are houses that are abusive.
You write about the scriptures and teachings that were very empowering to you while you were there. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the scriptures or passages that you found helpful to you?
Oh, I should say that as with a lot of traditional Muslims actually all over the world do not so much constantly center around the scriptures. And this is a misconception that I think a lot
Oh,
of
okay.
people have, because a lot of non-Muslims think it's all about the Quran and it's all about the sayings of the Prophet. Yes, it is, but it's also, there's a much more organic spiritual life around that. And for example, for a lot of Muslims in South Asia, the Sufi shrines, the shrines of the mystics that came long after
Mm,
the Prophet, are very important centers, and the teaching of these mystics, which often um, exists in the form of poems, for example, or
mm.
songs. So a lot of spirituality centers around that, and there are a lot of transgender elements actually in the teachings of these mystics, and these mystics always had a very close relationship with the transgender community, in particular in South Asia. So this was something that really impressed me. Um, the other thing that really impressed me is that um, the and we maybe are going to speak a little bit more about the title of my book later. But this title, Among the Eunuchs, has partly to do with the fact that in South Asia, these communities are always identified with the eunuch communities that used to serve in the royal Muslim palaces. And there is some justification for that. And these eunuchs also used to serve in the most holy places of Islam in Makkah and Medina. So they used to have a very sacred position there as well, of guarding the tomb of the Prophet, and guarding the most holy places of Islam. So that connection as well, that was very much emphasized in the community. I heard about that again and again, and the community is very proud of that. Um, Other than that, of course, there are also passages in the Quran that are very central to that, and my my personal most favorite verse in the Quran is Surah 4, verse 1, which explicitly says that all human beings were originally created from one single soul, and that in the end, it it tells us that these gender differences are in the end something very relative. Yes, they exist, and the Quran says a lot about that as well. Certain rules for men, certain rules for women, that does exist in the Quran and the Muslim traditions. But the fundamental idea is that we all come from one single soul, and this is a very fundamental idea for me. It is, I know that it's a very fundamental idea for a lot of LGBTQI Muslims and also for Muslim feminists. It's something that again, it has to do also with this idea of the divine unity to which everything goes back in the end. And in the same way, our human identities also go back to a single unity in the end.
The title of your book, you have word eunuchs there, and you actually reference a passage in the Bible, Matthew 19:12, where Jesus refers to eunuchs. and the blessings they're given to eunuchs specifically. And you talk about, you kind of expand on that. You provide some good exposition on that passage. And I wonder maybe you talk a little about why you refer to eunuchs in the title of your book, and then maybe a little bit about the blessing that Jesus gives them.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this gospel passage is that it speaks about three kinds of eunuchs. It speaks about eunuchs that were born eunuchs, it speaks about eunuchs that were made eunuchs by mankind, and it speaks about eunuchs that are eunuchs for the sake of the heavens. The Catholic Church, for example, bases its idea of celibacy on this last part, being eunuch for the sake of the heavens. We all have a good idea on what it means to be a eunuch who was made a eunuch by mankind. We know about the history of forced castration of slaves. That happened in a lot of societies, both European societies and Muslim societies, for a long, long time. We know about that. But who are eunuchs who were born eunuchs? This is something that, in particular, modern theologians often struggle with a little bit. But we do know that at the time of Jesus, there was this idea that there were people who were born in a specific gendered or sexual way, and who just did not belong to that heteronormative heterosexual world, and they were called eunuchs as well. We find that in Jewish scriptures as well. The Talmud has several categories, for example, for these kind of eunuchs. So that was an idea that existed in antiquity. Eunuchs were not just castrated men. That was one kind of eunuch. But other people who also somehow fell out of the gender binary were also seen as eunuchs. And this idea persisted in South Asia for much longer than in other parts of the world. And it also because there were indigenous Indian ideas that were comparable to that. And when Islam came to South Asia, it could adapt to those ideas very easily. So Islam came from that same, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern world that Jesus lived in. It brought these ideas to South Asia, and there you had similar ideas. So the combination of this created the South Asian idea of the eunuch. And as I said, until today, the eunuchs that served in the royal palaces of the Muslim nobility in India are very much identified with the third gender community. And we do know that indeed, there were definitely castrated slaves as well who were forced to work as eunuchs in the palaces, but we also know of several historical cases where people are specifically described as born eunuchs. So we do know that definitely the third gender community in South Asia was connected to these eunuch societies at the court. So this is not just, it's not just an imagined history. There really is a connection there. And and the words of Jesus, they tell us that there was always a very old connection also between this idea of falling out of the gender binary, but then also maybe being connected to God as well. And we see that in a lot of contexts. We see that in pagan contexts in the world that surrounded Jesus as well. There were a lot of cults of sacred eunuchs, which basically were very much like the third gender community is in India still today, and that we could identify as transgender. We have this phenomenon all over the world of, for example, there are a lot of indigenous people which believe that transgender people are specifically, they have a quality that makes them the perfect shamans, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So we have in a lot of cultures, we have this idea that people who fall out of the gender binary, they do have this specific connection to the supernatural.
Well, Leyla, I want to thank you so much for writing a beautiful book about your journey, and for coming on the podcast to share a little bit about that. You've done such a beautiful job explaining your own struggles, how you overcome them, and how the Muslim faith has helped you. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey, thank you so much for watching this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos just like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. Take care.